Hi, everyone. Welcome to the live stream of today's Google Hangout for Open Learning 18. I have Trudi Jacobson and Craig Gibson with me today, and I'm very excited to have them with us because our week's focus is the Framework for Information Literacy for Higher Education from ACRL. And Trudi and Craig were the original co-chairs of the task force that resulted in that very framework. So they're here to give us a little bit of the background on how the framework came to be, and they are also going to share their latest project with us.
Okay, thank you. So let me just move on and talk a little bit about the reason the task force sort of did what it did. And one of the things we were responding to when we developed the framework was the very different nature of the information environment and the research process for students today. And so there is a URL on this slide, padlet.com/tjacobson/research. And if you get a chance, we'd be really interested in sort of seeing your description or your observation of students' abilities to do research. And if you'd like to post them there, we will try to loop back to those. This slide cites some research from Allison, head of Project Information Literacy, and that organization has done some fabulous research connected to a wide variety of topics connected to information literacy. And in a 2010 survey, they found that 80% of students, so 8 out of 10 students that they surveyed in this study in 2010 reported having overwhelming difficulties getting started on research assignments and determining the nature and scope of what their instructors required of them. And beyond that, half of the students in the study also reported uncertainties with concluding and assessing the quality of their research efforts. So these students were really relying on the same tried and true resources to control the vast amount of information. So despite all the changes in the way information is now created and delivered, students were sort of having a difficult time. They were using sort of the same routine for completing one research assignment to the next. So they would write a thesis statement, add a personal perspective, develop a working outline. But over half the students did all of those things. And they were using techniques that they had learned in high school and then transferred to college, really without much in the way of change. So what they found was that the single most important missing element was context. So most students just don't make distinctions when regarding context when doing research. And Project Information Literacy developed a working typology of 4 research contexts that undergraduate students seek during their research processes. And those are shown in the bullets on this slide. And as I'd mentioned, students who were surveyed reported that they used the same few information sources regardless of what research context they were trying to satisfy and whether it was course-related or everyday life research. At the point that the task force started its work, what was in place was the ACRL Information Literacy Competency Standards, which took a very different approach than what's seen in the framework. There were 5 standards, and each standard had multiple performance indicators and outcomes. And an example of one of the standards was the information literate student determines the nature and extent of the information needed. So the task force really wanted to focus on the issues that you see on this slide, moving beyond the prescriptive and primarily behavioral and cognitive focus of the standards to a more fluid approach. And it was designed to apply in a wide range of higher education settings, from community colleges to research universities. Thus, it's flexible and it does not include prescribed learning outcomes. It also incorporates the concept of meta-literacy, which draws upon information literacy but emphasizes the networked and collaborative nature of information creation as well as consumption. of information. And then two domains that were largely missing from the earlier standards are the metacognitive and the affective, both of which are strong components of meta-literacy, and both are reflected in the framework. And at this point, Craig will delve more deeply into the framework and its potential.
So we decided early on, the task force that Trudi and I co-chaired, to look at a number of different models for information literacy. We looked widely internationally, and one of the models was an instructional design theory called threshold concepts. And we were intrigued by that initially. We had a member of our task force, Lori Townsend, who had done a lot of really good and intriguing work early about using threshold concepts in teaching. So just a little bit of background about what threshold concepts actually are. You can think of them as passages, portals, or gateways into gaining a wider understanding of a subject landscape, or perhaps another metaphor drawn from anthropology as a rite of passage to a new level of understanding. And it always involves, according to threshold concept theory, a liminal space where the learner moves through a very challenging or unsettling domain or area where they often get stuck. There are bottlenecks to understanding. So this slide shows the liminal state, idealized perhaps, where a novice approaches a new idea, a new concept, and experiences a lot of issues, confusing issues, a lot of anxiety and uncertainty. There may be difficult new ideas that are counterintuitive. There may be new vocabulary that's intimidating, and just generally an unfamiliar way of thinking. And the student, the learner, any of us, we've all experienced this at some point in our lives in learning something new or unfamiliar. And we need to think of the liminal state as a prime opportunity for deep learning with appropriate guidance. If there's signpost or guidance or encouragement for the learner to move through this space. And it doesn't often, the student or the learner doesn't come out of this often through instantaneous understanding. Sometimes there's an aha movement, but sometimes it's a period of prolonged struggle. So according to Meyer and Land, there are 5 characteristics of these. They are said to be transformative. That is, they cause the learner to experience a shift in perspective. They're integrative. They bring together smaller concepts or skills. Once the learner gets it, the learner cannot unlearn what has been learned. It's an irreversible process. They're often bounded. They help to demarcate boundaries of particular discipline. And of course, one of the prime features is that they are troublesome. So there's a tremendous amount of research and thinking that's gone on in the past 15 years about threshold concepts and particular disciplines. And on this slide, I'm just giving a few of those. Many of you have undergraduate degrees or graduate degrees in other areas, and you could probably think of others. These are just a few of them. They often involve a transformed way of understanding the field or the discipline. That's why they're called thresholds or threshold concepts. So we can think of learners as initiates or novices who begin to understand the field in a deeper way by learning one or more of these threshold concepts in their field. And then if we move on, we can see here just very schematically that often there's an initial state where there may be a naive conception or a misunderstanding, and that the learner has to progress through that via appropriate scaffolding by help from a faculty member, a librarian, or simply experience itself. And they traverse the threshold, often again through this oscillating process back and forth, and continued exposure to that concept over time. And then they are over the threshold. And again, it's often a messy process. It's not an easy process at all. So when on our task force, we took some earlier thinking and research ideas that have been proposed through a Delphi process, and we worked with these ideas, and we proposed 6 big ideas that would be the threshold concepts for information literacy, and these make up what we propose to call frames, hence the framework. So these 6 are authorities constructed and contextual, information creation as a process, information has value, research as inquiry, scholarship as conversation, and searching as strategic exploration. So the next slide just shows very schematically again what a frame might consist of. And the threshold concept is the underpinning idea. And then along with that, we proposed knowledge practices, which are really practices in the field or the domain, behaviors demonstrating understanding. And then along with that, the habits of mind, or perhaps the attitudinal or the valuing dimensions of learning that are so important. So, curricular applications. In thinking about openness, which is the theme of your course, it occurred to me that frameworks or a framework is inherently open itself as a metaphor. A framework is an open system because it doesn't prescribe, it provides views of an intellectual landscape in which scholars have learned to maneuver over time. Also, the frames themselves, the 6 that we proposed, are open to each other. They are interconnected. They're an interconnected web of ideas. For example, scholarship on this slide is interwoven with inquiry, which in turn depends on a highly contextualized view of authority. A framework like this one opens up the door to conversations with others outside the library field, faculty and students themselves, and promotes a common conversation. And there is an interdisciplinary aspect of the framework as well. We can think of these as big ideas that span disciplines, and that faculty and students and others can have common conversations around. So in contrast to that, the following slide shows what Trudi was talking about earlier with the closed competencies, where we had the 5 standards, and then these were kind of like silos. And students will identify an information need, and underneath that, specific skills, or students will evaluate the information found, and there's a list of an inventory or a checklist of specific skills. And there were not enough intersections among the old standards. And what we propose to do with the framework is to show the cross-cutting nature of these skills, how they integrate into each other. And remember, that's one of the features of threshold concepts, that they promote integrative learning. So implications for us to think about, it really requires even greater collaboration between librarians and faculty and others on campuses. There's a major focus on sustaining learning experiences or trajectories of learning over time. And there's a major focus on what I call formative assessment, but taking that to another level, so that there's investigation together of how learning happens in different contexts. So further implications, a lot of need for curriculum rethinking, revision, and institution or program specific learning outcomes need to be thought of locally. And then I think particularly intriguing is the prospect of using students themselves as partners in what we call instructional research or pedagogical research. So Trudi will now talk about some integration of threshold concepts in some of her teaching experience.
So yes, these next two slides sort of talk about how what I was thinking about when teaching really changed when using the framework. As Craig mentioned before, I mean, when he was talking about openness, the frames can be used singly or in combination. There's a lot of sort of conversation between them, depending on your desired learning outcomes and the scope of the instruction. So right here, this is an example of a combination that I used in one of my information literacy courses. And it inspired me using the scholarship as conversation frame to talk about the idea of seminal articles. And I never really would have thought about teaching this concept in the past, but bringing in this idea of scholarship as conversation and integrating some of the things that I might have been teaching otherwise, but maybe a little bit more standards-based, I think it was sort of an aha moment. And then a second example with searching as strategic exploration, thinking about research as an iterative process, the value of serendipity, and bringing in again the database searching idea. But it's inspired combinations of things or bringing in things that I probably would not have done in the past. And I will now turn it back over to Craig to talk a little bit about some of the work we've been doing more recently.
So Trudi and I just putting out a little plug for a forthcoming article that we have in RESA Quarterly, Reference and User Services Quarterly, the March issue. Some of what I'm addressing here comes from that article, using the framework to develop communities of inquiry and this idea of habits of mind in a very uncertain information world. If we think about the signs of the times that we live in, we see this every day, we hear about it in our political and cultural climate, the tribalism, the uncertainty about expertise itself, the polarized discourse, the filter bubbles, the different media ecosystems that we live in, and often even the questioning of how knowledge itself gets decided. So what are the opportunities? We really, this environment that we're living in has really poses enormous challenges for anyone involved in teaching and learning. So I think that if we move on here, we need to think about higher education really being organized around communities of inquiry. They're becoming the organizing structure for higher education. In other words, we really need to take the older idea of community of scholars and make it into the community of learners and really be more inclusive about that. And I think these communities of inquiry really need to be focused around critical reflection, focused on big transcendent questions that underpin scholarship, research, and teaching, and that these communities of inquiry should drive course design and interdisciplinary research and teaching. Many of you might be, I'm sure, are familiar with what we have known as high impact practices for transformative learning. We're just putting up a few of these here. Inquiry-based courses, first-year seminars, service learning, undergraduate research. These are the practices that provide sustained learning experiences, grappling with difficult or challenging ideas, knowing how to think and practice in a discipline, and perhaps learning how to deal with others in our academic environments who have very different perspectives, or how to integrate complex ideas, for example, in capstone or synthesis courses. And these high impact practices provide support under the mentoring of others for negotiating what we know as liminal spaces and shifting identities as learners. So I just want to show a little bit of how Trudi and I have been thinking about using the framework in this way, connected with high impact practices. If, for example, we focus on the frame research as inquiry, and we pick out one of the knowledge practices, formulate questions for research based on information gaps, and then a disposition from that same frame, maintaining an open mind and critical stance. We could combine those into what I'd call a learning goal. Not necessarily a learning outcome. I'm thinking about something larger. In this case, developing a research question that requires ongoing reflection, open-mindedness, and sustained attention to conflicting information. How appropriate for our times. Sustained attention to conflicting information. So we can think of this learning goal as a kind of a through line that might connect a lot of different assignments or learning experiences in one course or a unit in a course. So in a first year writing course, for example, here's what it might look like. Students develop one research question on the topic of sustainability that they investigate through inquiry in 3 different information sources. And they're called upon to engage in inquiry through doing this, the curiosity and open-mindedness of exploration and grappling with different perspectives. And an assignment like this would really capture the spirit of the framework, which encourages openness and emergent learning, maybe even dissonant learning, and makes students themselves more the agents of their own learning. Now, if we take that same idea in a senior capstone course, this is what it might look like. The students would create a research proposal with a well-defined research question and 2 sub-questions on the relationship between sustainability and community development, and seek to create a solution for a local community problem. So if we're thinking about the architecture of how to use the framework throughout curricula, this is just one example of how that might work. So I'll close out with a quote actually from our forthcoming article about transformative learning experiences requiring one's own mindset, challenging one's own mindset to recognize the need to confront and effectively and consistently grapple with biases, predilections, and worldviews. It is particularly hard to do so today when much of the information one encounters has been presented from within a filter bubble that mirrors one's own convictions. So again, returning to the idea of communities of inquiry paired with high impact practices and thinking about knowledge practices and dispositions from the framework, opening up conversations on campus, creating these communities, and thinking about larger learning experiences for everyone. So Trudi, other thoughts that you have?
Maybe we can open it up for questions.
Great. We do have a few questions from the Twitter chat that I can share. One is, are the liminal spaces that Craig talked about in the design of information, are those at all connected with Vygotsky's idea of zone of proximal
Development.
Proximal development.
Yes.
So if you're familiar with that theory, is that something that's referenced in the information literacy development work?
Well, no, not per se, but I think there probably are some similarities with that. That zone of proximal development is often thought of as a zone of prime learning opportunity with the help of a more capable other, a faculty member, a librarian, another student, a peer, and it's the liminal space is not thought of in quite that way because it always involves this oscillation or moving back and forth, and perhaps maybe even longer time span and grappling with a difficult idea. But Trudi, do you have any additional thoughts about that? That's just my take on the similarities.
Yeah, and I think we did talk about the zone of proximal development in the discussions in the task force, if I'm remembering correctly.
Yeah, it's been a few years, but
yeah,
I think that's probably probably right.
Well, I love this idea of connecting the frames to the higher impact practices, and we talk a lot about those on my campus. I'm sure those conversations are happening on a lot of our campuses, and it's exciting to think about being able to use the framework that those of us in libraries are getting more familiar with, as it's been around for a few years now, to help try to address some of those and give students the opportunity to engage in those high impact practices. So I loved the examples that you gave. It's always nice to have concrete examples as well, that we can think about how could we take this home and apply it in our own daily work.
And I think it would be great if this idea appeals to people, if they start developing some of their own and start sharing them too, because that might spark more ideas.
Absolutely. Those might be things that I would think might show up in the sandbox.
Yes.
Yes, some of those are already there. We just encourage more development of them.
Great. So one thing that I think I am still stuck in liminal space on is how information literacy and meta literacy connect, and which one is the overarching, and why isn't the framework for meta literacy? Why did it end up the framework for information
literacy? So I can talk a little bit about sort of the development of meta literacy, which was really starting to think about, I mean, there's all these different literacies people talk about, digital literacy and visual literacy and media literacy and such. And Tom Mackey and I started to sort of examine where there were elements in common. And information literacy really covered a number of them, but the definition, when we were working on the idea of meta literacy back in 2010, something like that, really was an older definition and a somewhat out of date definition. And so we were thinking about meta literacy with the meta could cover a variety of different ideas, but sort of an overarching literacy. And then one that really is appropriate for today's connected, collaborative information world. So we had a lot of conversations about it within the committee, the task force that was working on this, and there were a variety of different opinions. And there was the idea of sort of pulling it out more. There was the idea of integrating it more. The integration is one out. So there are pieces of it throughout, but I think that information literacy is such an accepted idea. Meta literacy was newer. And so I think that's why the information literacy, which sort of has is better understood, is the framework for information literacy rather than meta literacy, even though that really influences parts of it.
The other thing that I'm excited about is the way all of this connects to the work that we're doing in open learning. So it is a very, it's a network space, it's a collaborative space. Participants are information creators as well as consumers in that space. And so I think consciously or subconsciously, I think we're tapping into some of those frames in the framework, even as we're constructing the experience for open learning. So I know there are a lot of librarians in the mix this time in terms of participants, and I hope they're all thinking about how the framework applies to what they're doing in Open Learning 18.
Yeah, when we started the task force in 2012, we really didn't anticipate, the enormous interest in open learning. That was a few years ago. I mean, this has surged to the fore a whole lot more. So I think we maybe anticipated this a little bit, or we see a natural alignment or fit between the framework and open learning in general. And there are the many varieties of openness. And I tried to touch on those a little bit here today.
That was great, Craig. I really appreciated those ties to open. Wonderful. Yeah, and I like the way that you describe the framework as an open system. and that the 6 frames are open to each other. I think that's worth giving some thought to. And I know I'm going to take that away and ponder it a little bit more. We do have another question from the Twitter chat. Is meta literacy equivalent to critical thinking, at least in some respects?
And I've often heard information literacy as being equivalent to critical thinking. I certainly think that it's a big component of it, but it goes beyond it. There's so many ideas in it, sort of learner as teacher type of idea, the critical self-reflection, which could be part of critical thinking. So it's certainly a component of it.
Okay. And then we've also got a question about some of the resistance or criticism of the framework. I know I remember as I was following the development of it, and it was out in draft form, and we were encouraged to submit comments. There was certainly a lot of flutter on some of my listservs about all of it, and I'm wondering, has that died down? Has that gone away? Do you think there's still some resistance to the framework, or has everybody just decided to get on board?
I don't know. I mean, we created the infrastructure to make it possible for people to contribute. And I think we wanted to be as open as possible, speaking of open, when we were developing the framework and inviting all of the commentary about it. I'm sure there's still resistance here and there, but we think we see a lot of buy-in, participation, maybe with parts of the framework or with seeing how it confirms what a lot of people were already doing with their teaching. Maybe they didn't use the same terminology that we used, but we think that it's been able to help advance the discussion and conversation in the profession of librarianship, but maybe more important, in collaboration with others on campus. I think it's been a real move forward with that whole collaborative movement.
And I think with the sandbox that you mentioned earlier, Sue, and other sharing of what people are doing, I think that there's maybe a better understanding. And I think that's helping with the buy-in, sort of seeing what other people are doing and sort of thinking how that might translate to your own environment, rather than sort of feeling maybe at the very beginning you didn't have a way in because it was so different.
Mm-hmm. And complex too. We had a Twitter chat earlier this week, and one of the comments that came up there is the complexity of the framework document, the document itself, and how it really requires a few readings through to really start to be able to unpack it. And I think the sandbox and other efforts like that probably go a long way to help people make it something that's practical, that they can really use every day. It's not a theoretical document. I mean, it certainly has theory behind it, but it's something we can execute. Okay, well, I think that's it for our questions. Any last thoughts that you want to share with us today? I know we're all really looking forward to that article coming out in RUSA in March, so thanks for mentioning that. I'll put in one more plug for that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, we really appreciated being invited here and having a chance to talk about this. So thank you for that.
Oh, thank you, Sue and Gardner. Yeah, we really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. And we will stay tuned through the Twitter sphere.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.